Imagine standing in the middle of a crowded room where half the people speak only English and the other half speak only French. They're trying to decide where to eat dinner. Sounds impossible, right? Now imagine that room is a country, and the decision isn't about dinner, it's about whether human beings can be owned as property. This is America in the 1850s. Two entirely different civilizations occupying the same borders, speaking the same language, but meaning completely different things when they said words. Like freedom and liberty and rights, one side saw the future in factories and free labor. The other saw it in plantations and enslaved people picking cotton under the southern sun. Tonight, as the world grows quiet around you, we journey back to the decade when America discovered that some arguments cannot be won with words alone, when compromise became impossible, when the storm clouds gathered slowly and inevitably across a troubled land. Let us begin not with the war itself, but with the question that made war inevitable. The United States in 1850 was really two nations pretending to be one. The North was transforming rapidly. Cities swelled with immigrants. Factories multiplied. Railroads stretched across the landscape like iron veins, pumping commerce and people. Through an industrializing society, free labor workers who could move negotiate wages. Seek better opportunities was the engine of northern prosperity. Slavery was increasingly seen not just as immoral, but as economically obsolete, a relic of a dying age. But in the South, a very different world existed, an agrarian society built on a foundation of enslaved labor where cotton was king and the entire social structure depended on maintaining that brutal institution. Southern planters didn't see slavery as a necessary evil, they defended it as a positive good ordained by God and nature. Their wealth, their status, their entire way of life rested on the backs of 4 million enslaved people who had no rights, no freedom, no humanity recognized by law. Two visions of America, two economies, two moral universes, and only one constitution, trying desperately to hold them together. The question was no longer if they would split apart, but when. For decades, American politicians had been master craftsmen of compromise, carefully maintaining the balance between free and slave states like a tightrope walker balancing blades. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 drew a line across the map, slavery allowed below. Freedom above, problem solved, right? For 30 years it held, but then came 1850 and California's application for statehood threatened to tip the balance toward the free states. And enter the Compromise of 1850, orchestrated by aging Senator Henry Clay, who'd spent his career preventing this very crisis. California would be free, but to appease the South, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, a law so draconian, so morally repugnant that it radicalized thousands of Northern moderates overnight. Now enslaved people who'd escaped to freedom in the North could be hunted down and dragged back south. Northern citizens could be forced to assist in capturing human beings. Fleeing bondage, federal commissioners were paid more money for returning a person to slavery than for setting them free. The compromise meant to save the Union actually accelerated its destruction, because it forced Northerners who'd been content to ignore slavery, where it existed, to become active participants in its cruelty, and that changed everything. Here's what most history books don't emphasize enough: the real accelerant of division wasn't just slavery's existence, it was its expansion. In 1854, Senator Stephen Douglas introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which tore up the Missouri Compromise and let territories decide slavery through popular sovereignty, letting settlers vote on whether to allow slavery. Sounds democratic, right? But here's the twist that ignited the powder keg. It led to actual war before the Civil War. Pro-slavery settlers from Missouri flooded into Kansas. Anti-slavery settlers poured in from the North. Both sides came armed. Bleeding Kansas saw neighbors murdering neighbors, towns burned, militias clashing in open combat. John Brown, a radical abolitionist, massacred pro-slavery settlers at Pottawatomie Creek with swords in the dead of night. Pro-slavery forces sacked the Free State town of Lawrence. Over 200 people died in what amounted to a territorial civil war, a preview of the national catastrophe to come. The veneer of civility was cracking. Violence was becoming the language both sides understood. By 1857, even the Supreme Court was taking sides. In the Dred Scott decision, Chief Justice Roger Taney ruled that black people, enslaved or free, could never be American citizens, that enslaved people were property, not persons, that Congress had no authority to ban slavery in the territories. With one decision, the court invalidated every compromise, denied every hope for containing slavery's spread, and told millions of black Americans they had no rights the white man was bound to respect. The North was outraged, the South was emboldened, and the political center, those moderate voices calling for patience and compromise, simply collapsed. There was no middle ground anymore. You either believed slavery was fundamentally wrong and must be restricted, or you believed it was right and must be protected and expanded. Two Americas, two incompatible visions, one union that couldn't hold them both. As the 1850s drew to a close, violence became normalized. Congressman Preston Brooks of South Carolina beat Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts nearly to death with a cane on the Senate floor for giving an anti-slavery speech. Southern congressmen started carrying weapons to legislative sessions. Northern states passed personal liberty laws to nullify the Fugitive Slave Act. The Democratic Party, which had bridged North and South, began to fracture along sectional lines. And then in October 1859, John Brown, that same radical from Kansas, led a raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, hoping to start a slave uprising that would burn slavery out of the South like a fever. He failed. He was captured, tried, and hanged. But his execution made him a martyr in the North and a terrorist in the South. The chasm was now unbridgeable. So as you drift toward sleep tonight, consider this. America spent 70 years trying to avoid a conversation it needed to have. 70 years of compromise, delay, wishful thinking, all in service of preserving a union that was becoming a lie. The seeds of division had been planted at the nation's founding. By the 1850s, they'd grown into a forest too thick to see through, and beyond that forest, a storm was gathering. Gentle pause, soft transition. The question was no longer if the storm would break, only who would survive when it did. And that answer would begin with an election that would shatter the fragile peace forever. November 6, 1860, election night in America. In Springfield, Illinois, a tall, gaunt lawyer named Abraham Lincoln watched telegraph reports arrive with news that would change the world. In Charleston, South Carolina, those same telegraphs sparked jubilation, not because their candidate won, but because Lincoln's victory gave them exactly the excuse they'd been waiting for. The most democratic act, a free election, was about to destroy the Union. Here's the irony that should keep you thinking as you drift toward sleep. Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot in 10 southern states. They wouldn't allow it, and yet his election was somehow considered an intolerable threat. How does a man who didn't receive a single Southern vote become the reason for Southern secession? Tonight we explore the election that shattered a nation, not because of what Lincoln did, but because of what the South feared he might do. The election of 1860 wasn't a contest between two candidates. It was four separate campaigns happening in four separate Americas. Abraham Lincoln represented the brand-new Republican Party, formed just 6 years earlier. On a single platform, stop slavery's expansion into new territories, not abolish it where it existed. Lincoln himself said he had no constitutional authority to do that, just prevent it from spreading. For the North, this seemed reasonable. For the South, it was a death sentence to their way of life. Stephen Douglas, Lincoln's old rival, ran as a Northern Democrat preaching popular sovereignty. Let each territory decide for itself, but the Southern Democrats had already split away, nominating John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky on a platform demanding federal a protection of slavery everywhere, including territories. And then there was John Bell of Tennessee, running for the Constitutional Union Party, whose entire platform was essentially, please, can we just not talk about slavery and maybe this will all go away? 4 men, 4 visions, 1 office. The nation held its breath. Here's what most people don't realize about Lincoln's victory. He won with only 40% of the popular vote. Nearly 6 out of 10 Americans voted for someone else. But the Electoral College told a different story. Lincoln swept every northern state and won decisively, 180 electoral votes to his nearest competitor's 72. He didn't need a single Southern vote, and that fact terrified the South more than anything Lincoln had ever said. Because it meant the balance had finally shifted. The North's growing population and industrial power now dominated national politics. The South could no longer veto, negotiate, or compromise its way to protecting slavery. They were now a permanent minority in their own country. The South faced a choice: accept a future where slavery would be slowly strangled by free states and free territories surrounding it, or leave the Union entirely and create their own nation where slavery would be protected forever. In Charleston, even before all the votes were counted, the choice was already made. December 20th, 1860, South Carolina's secession convention voted unanimously to leave the Unions. The document they published wasn't shy about their reasoning. They explicitly stated that Northern states had failed to return fugitive slaves, that the election of a president whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery made remaining in the Union impossible. This was about slavery, full stop. Within 6 weeks, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed. By February 1861, before Lincoln even took office, 7 states had left. In Montgomery, Alabama, they formed a new government, the Confederate States of America, and elected Jefferson Davis as president. These weren't hot-headed rebels acting rashly. These were calculated decisions made by wealthy, educated men in expensive suits, meeting in ornate chambers following proper parliamentary procedure to destroy the United States of America, democracy being used to end democracy. Abraham Lincoln wouldn't become president until March 4th, 1861. For 4 months he watched helplessly as the Union dissolved, unable to do anything because James Buchanan was still technically president. and Buchanan did essentially nothing. When Lincoln finally took office, 7 states were already gone, 4 more Virginia. Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee were waiting to see what he'd do. The border. States Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri teetered on the edge, torn between loyalty to the Union and sympathy for the South. Lincoln's inaugural address was a masterpiece of careful language, trying desperately to thread an impossible needle. He reassured the South he wouldn't interfere with slavery where it existed, but he also made clear he would not accept secession. The Union was a perpetual, permanent, unbreakable. We are not enemies but friends, he pleaded. We must not be enemies. But they already were. The Confederate States of America was now a functioning government with its own constitution, one that was remarkably similar to the U.S. Constitution except for the parts that explicitly protected slavery forever. Their constitution prohibited any law denying or impairing the right of property in Negro slaves, state rights they claimed except when those rights might threaten slavery. Then, the Confederate federal government could override them. Jefferson Davis, in his inaugural address, spoke of defending their homes, their families, their sacred honor. He spoke of our new government as a beacon of liberty. The cognitive dissonance was staggering, building a nation on slavery while claiming to fight for freedom. Both sides were now convinced they were the true heirs of the American Revolution. Both believed God was on their side. Both thought the other was tyrannical, dangerous, and must be stopped. So as you drift deeper into rest tonight, consider this. The election of 1860 proved that democracy only works when everyone agrees to accept the results, when one side decides that losing an election justifies leaving the country entirely. Democracy itself becomes the crisis. Lincoln had won fairly. He'd followed every rule. He'd made no threats beyond restricting slavery's expansion, and yet the South saw his mere existence as president as intolerable. The question now wasn't whether war would come, it was where and when the first shots would be fired. 7 states had left, 11 eventually would, and in a harbor, Charleston, at a fort called Sumter, the answer was already taking shape. The storm had broken, the talking was over. All that remained was to see who would fire first and whether the blood spilled could ever be washed clean. Picture a small brick fortress on a man-made island in Charleston Harbor. Inside, 85 Union soldiers under Major Robert Anderson, surrounded by water and Confederate artillery. Batteries positioned on every shore. Outside, thousands of Confederate troops waiting for the order to fire. And in Washington, a new president facing his first crisis, knowing that whatever he decides will either prevent war or ignite it. This is Fort Sumter in April 1861, a garrison that neither side could afford to back down from. A symbol that had become more important than the men trapped inside it. For months, everyone had talked about war, threatened it, predicted it, prepared for it. But no one had actually started it. That was about to change, and when it did, both sides would discover that starting a war is far easier than ending one. Let us drift back to that spring morning when America stopped talking and started killing. Major Robert Anderson found himself in an impossible position through no fault of his own. He commanded a small Union garrison in Charleston Harbor, federal property in the heart of secession. Originally stationed at Fort Moultrie on the mainland, Anderson had quietly moved his men to Fort Sumter in late December, recognizing that the island fort was more defensible. South Carolina considered this a provocative act. Anderson considered it A common sense. Now, months later, his supplies were running out, his men were hungry, and President Lincoln faced a choice: resupply the fort and risk war, or abandon it and effectively recognize a Confederate independence. Lincoln chose a middle path. He would send supply ships with food and medicine only, no weapons or reinforcements. He notified South Carolina Governor Francis Pickens of his intentions: transparent, non-threatening, just feeding soldiers on federal property. But Confederate President Jefferson Davis saw it differently. Any attempt to resupply Sumter was an act of aggression. If the supply ships arrived, the Confederacy would look weak. If they fired on the ships, they'd be the aggressors. But if they forced Sumter's surrender before the ships arrived, the order went out: take the fort. 4:30 a.m. April 12, 1861. Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard, ironically, a former student of Major Anderson, sent a final demand for surrender. Anderson refused but admitted his supplies would run out in a few days. Beauregard's officers saw their opening: they'd bombard the fort into submission before the supply ships arrived. At 4:30 a.m., a single mortar shot arced across the pre-dawn darkness, exploding above Fort Sumter like a signal flare. Then the harbor erupted. 43 Confederate guns opened fire simultaneously. Shells screamed through the air: solid shot, explosive shells, heated cannonballs designed to set wooden structures ablaze. The bombardment was so intense that people in Charleston climbed to their rooftops to watch, treating it like entertainment, a spectacle, the birth of a nation, they believed. Inside Sumter, Anderson's men huddled in the fort's lower levels as masonry crumbled. Around them, they had 48 guns, but only enough gunpowder to fire a fraction of them. They returned fire sporadically, more gesture than genuine defense. Everyone knew how this would end. For 34 hours, the bombardment continued. The fort's barracks caught fire. Smoke choked the garrison. Hot metal and brick fragments rained down. Miraculously, no one died. The Confederates were either terrible shots or deliberately avoiding killing anyone, depending on who you asked. Here's what's remarkable about Fort Sumter: it was the bloodiest bloodless battle American history. Not a single soldier died from the bombardment itself. After 34 hours of nearly 4,000 shells being fired, the worst injuries were from exhaustion and smoke inhalation. When Anderson finally surrendered on April 13th, Beauregard allowed him to fire a final salute to the American flag before evacuating. During that ceremonial salute, a cannon misfired. 2 Union soldiers were killed instantly. Third died later from wounds. These were the only casualties of Fort Sumter, killed not by enemy fire but by accident during surrender. So the Civil War began with a paradox: the most bombarded position of the entire conflict produced the fewest deaths. Everyone still believed war would be civilized, controlled, honorable. Both sides thought they'd prove their point quickly and everyone would go home. They had no idea what they'd started, no concept of the industrial-scale slaughter that awaited them. The day after Sumter's surrender, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. The response was overwhelming. In the North, men flooded recruitment offices, terrified the war would end before they could participate. 90-day enlistments, surely that would be enough time. But Lincoln's call for troops had an immediate consequence. The 4 border states still in the Union had to choose. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina could no longer Remain neutral. If they sent troops to suppress the rebellion, they were choosing the Union. If they refused, they were choosing the Confederacy. All four chose the Confederacy. In a matter of days, the Confederate States of America grew. From 7 states to 11, the South gained Virginia's industrial capacity, Tennessee's resources, and most critically, Virginia's military talent, including Robert E. Lee, who'd been offered command of the Union Army but couldn't bring himself to fight against his home state. The loss of Virginia moved the Confederate capital from Montgomery to Richmond, just 100 miles from Washington. The two capitals would spend the war staring at each other across a narrow strip of blood-soaked Virginia countryside. In both capitals, the mood was jubilant. Brass bands played, flags waved, young men brand new uniforms drilled awkwardly in public squares, more enthusiastic than competent. Southern newspapers predicted the war would be over by summer. One Yankee could whip 10 Yankees, they claimed. Northern papers were equally confident the rebellion would collapse at the first show of real force. Neither side had fought a major war in decades. Neither had any concept of what modern weapons could do to human bodies. Both sides romanticized war as a test of courage and adventure, a chance to prove oneself. Poetry and honor and glory. They talked about war the way you might talk about a football game, something exciting where your team would obviously win. The reality would be different, so much worse than anyone imagined. As you drift deeper into sleep tonight, consider this. Fort Sumter's bloodless bombardment was the last moment of innocence before the storm. For 34 hours, cannonballs flew and no one died. It seemed almost like a performance, a show of force rather than genuine violence. Both sides could still pretend war was civilized. But that illusion was about to shatter completely, because in just 3 months those same eager recruits, those same confident newspapers, those same jubilant crowds would face a different reality on a field called Bull Run's gentle, foreboding transition. And there the adventure would become a nightmare, the glory would become horror, and both sides would learn that starting a war is far easier than stopping one. July 21st, 1861. A hot Sunday morning near Manassas, Virginia, congressmen and their wives rode out from Washington in carriages, bringing picnic baskets and champagne. They'd come to watch the Union Army crush the rebellion. Some brought opera glasses for better view. It was supposed to be a spectacle, entertainment, a quick demonstration of Northern superiority. By evening, those same spectators would be fleeing in panic, their carriages abandoned. Champagne spilled in the dust, as terrified soldiers streamed past them in chaotic retreat. The first battle of Bull Run, called First Manassas in the South, was where America discovered that war wasn't glorious, it was chaos, and neither side was remotely ready for it. Tonight, as you settle into comfort, we explore the battle that shattered every illusion about what this war would be. Both armies that met at Bull Run were amateur in every sense of the word. Union General Irvin McDowell commanded about 35,000 men, most of whom had enlisted. Just months earlier, they'd received minimal training. Many didn't know how to load their rifles properly. Their officers had learned tactics from textbooks written about Napoleonic warfare, completely unprepared for the reality of rifled muskets that could kill at 300 yards. Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard, the same man who'd bombarded Fort Sumter, commanded roughly 32,000 troops in similar condition. Enthusiastic but inexperienced, poorly supplied. operating on assumptions about warfare that were 50 years out of date. McDowell's plan was actually quite sophisticated on paper, a flanking maneuver around the Confederate left while a diversionary attack held their center. It might have worked with professional soldiers. With raw recruits, it became a comedy of errors before a shot was even fired. Units got lost, officers couldn't read maps, soldiers stopped to pick berries or fill canteens. Breaking formation. What should have been a dawn attack didn't begin until mid-morning. Because nobody could get organized. And then they started shooting. The battle was chaos from the start. Units attacked and retreated and attacked again with no overall coordination. Soldiers shot at their own side because nobody's uniforms were standardized yet. Some Union troops wore gray, some Confederate troops wore blue. The smoke from thousands of muskets and artillery pieces created a fog so thick that commanders couldn't see what was happening. For hours, the battle swung back and forth across a plateau called Henry House Hill. Confederate General Thomas Jackson stood with his Virginia Brigade at a crucial moment, refusing to retreat despite heavy fire. Another Confederate officer reportedly said, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall." The nickname stuck. Stonewall Jackson was born in that the moment. The Union attack was actually succeeding initially. Confederate lines were breaking. Soldiers were fleeing. It looked like the northern newspapers might be right after all, one big battle, and the rebellion would collapse. Then Confederate reinforcements arrived by railroad, the first time in history that railroads moved troops to a battlefield quickly enough to affect the outcome. Here's what changed the battle completely: a single terrifying sound that froze Union soldiers in their tracks. The rebel yelled. Thousands of Confederate soldiers charging forward, screaming a high-pitched, wavering shriek that one Union soldier described as sounding like all the demons of hell turned loose. It wasn't coordinated, it wasn't an official tactic. It was just spontaneous, primal. Terrifying. Combined with the sudden arrival of fresh troops, the psychological impact shattered the already shaky Union line. These weren't professional soldiers used to holding formation. Under stress, these were farm boys and shop clerks in uniform, and suddenly nothing made sense anymore. The Union retreat started orderly, then it became a rout. Soldiers dropped their rifles and ran. Officers couldn't stop them. The carefully planned withdrawal became a panicked stampede back toward Washington. And those spectators from Washington, those picnicking congressmen and socialites, they found themselves caught in a flood of terrified soldiers, abandoned cannons overturned. Wagons, their carriages blocked the roads, the bridges became bottlenecks. What had started as entertainment became a nightmare. The retreat to Washington was one of the most humiliating moments in U.S. military history. Exhausted soldiers stumbled through the night, some marching backward, convinced the Confederates were pursuing them. They weren't. The Confederate Army was just as disorganized and exhausted, but fear and imagination created a phantom army of pursuers that seemed to be everywhere. Officers abandoned their commands, soldiers threw away equipment to run faster, some didn't stop until they reached the fortifications around Washington, where they collapsed in exhausted heaps. The carefully drilled, confident army that had marched out that morning was now a mob of traumatized men who discovered that real combat was nothing like they'd imagined. In Washington, panic spread. Would the Confederates attack the Capitol? Lincoln stayed up all night expecting to see Confederate troops marching down Pennsylvania Avenue. They never came. Beauregard's army was too disorganized to pursue, but the fear was real. The North had been humiliated. The quick, glorious victory everyone predicted had turned into disaster, and suddenly the war everyone thought would end in weeks looked like it might last much longer. The casualty numbers from Bull Run seem almost quaint compared to what would come. Later, about 460 Union soldiers killed, 1,124 wounded, around 387 Confederate dead, 1,582 wounded. But these numbers shocked both sides, nearly 5,000 casualties in a single day. It was the bloodiest battle on American soil up to that point, and it was just the beginning. The romantic notions about war died at Bull Run. The newspaper poetry about glory and honor gave way to harder truths. Young men discovered that courage didn't stop bullets. That confusion and chaos defined combat more than heroic charges. That war was mostly fear, exhaustion, and random deaths. Both sides realized they needed better training, better generals, better everything. Those 90-day enlistments were extended to 3 years. The professional generals started being taken seriously. Both armies began the slow, painful process of transforming enthusiastic amateurs into actual soldiers. The war would continue for 4 more years, and Bull Run would seem like a skirmish. Compared to battles like Antietam, Gettysburg, and Cold Harbor, where the daily death toll would exceed Bull Run's entire casualty count several times over. As you drift toward sleep tonight, consider this. Bull Run killed the last innocent illusions about war. Before Bull Run, young men rushed to enlist afraid they'd miss the adventure. After Bull Run, they enlisted knowing exactly what they were getting into. The spectators never returned to watch battles. The newspapers stopped printing romantic poetry and started publishing casualty lists. Both sides had wanted war, convinced of quick victory. Bull Run taught them that victory would be neither quick nor certain, that this conflict would demand everything they had and more. But while armies clashed on land, another kind of warfare was unfolding on America's rivers and coastlines, a quieter war, a slower war, but one that would ultimately prove just as decisive. Imagine trying to strangle an entire nation without anyone noticing it was happening. That was the Union's Anaconda Plan, named for the snake that kills by slowly constricting its prey. While dramatic battles captured headlines, a quieter campaign was underway. Hundreds of ships blockading thousands of miles of southern coastline, cutting off the Confederacy's economic lifeline one port at a time. No glory, no dramatic charges, just ships sitting off harbors month after month slowly suffocating southern commerce. And if that sounds boring, consider this. This was where the future of naval warfare was being written. Tonight, as you drift along these dark waters, we explore the war at sea, where innovation met desperation, and the fate of nations was decided not with cavalry charges, but with iron ships and patient waiting. The Confederacy's economy depended on cotton exports and imported manufactured goods. No cotton sales meant no money. No imports meant no weapons, no medicine, no industrial equipment. The problem was the Union Navy in April 1861 consisted of only 42 ships, and many were scattered around the world. The Confederacy had virtually no navy at all, yet the South had 3,500 miles of coastline and dozens of ports. How do you blockade that with 42 ships? Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles faced an impossible task, so he did something. Audacious, he bought every ship he could find, merchant vessels, ferries, tugboats, anything that could float and mount a cannon. Within months, the Union Navy grew to over 260 ships. By war's end, it would be the largest navy in the world. These weren't glamorous warships. They were converted civilian vessels, poorly armed and uncomfortable, tasked with the most boring duty imaginable, sitting off a harbor for months, watching for blockade runners. Sailors called it monotony punctuated by terror because most days were crushingly dull, until suddenly a fast ship would appear out of the night and you'd have minutes to react. But slowly, methodically, the Anaconda's coils tightened. March 8, 1862, Hampton Roads, Virginia. A strange ship emerged from Norfolk, the CSS Virginia, formerly the USS Merrimac. The Union had scuttled and burned her when they abandoned Norfolk, but the Confederates had salvaged the hull and covered it with 4 inches of iron armor. She looked like a floating barn roof, ungainly and slow, but she was invincible to traditional naval weapons. The Virginia steamed into Hampton Roads and attacked the Union blockade fleet. Cannonballs bounced off her armor like pebbles. She rammed and sank the USS Cumberland, then set the USS Congress ablaze. In a single afternoon, the Virginia made every wooden warship in the world obsolete. The Union Navy panicked. If the Virginia broke out into the Atlantic, she could destroy the entire blockade. She could bombard coastal cities with impunity. The war could turn on this. A single ship. But the Union had been building its own ironclad, a bizarre vessel called the Monitor. Designed by Swedish engineer John Ericsson, she looked even stranger than the Virginia. Flat deck with a revolving turret containing 2 11-inch guns. Sailors called her a cheese box on a raft. The Monitor arrived at Hampton Roads on the evening of March 8th, just hours after the Virginia's rampage. March 9th, 1862, the first battle between ironclad warships in history. For 4 hours, the Virginia and Monitor circled each other, firing at point-blank range. Shells clanged off iron armor. Neither could seriously damage the other. It was like watching 2 armored knights swing swords that couldn't pierce each other's arm. January 1st, 1863. Midnight approached in the White House, and Abraham Lincoln sat at his desk with a pen in his hand, preparing to sign a document that would transform the war and alter the course of human history. His hand was trembling. Not from doubt. Lincoln had spent months preparing for this moment. His hand shook from exhaustion. He'd spent the entire day at the traditional New Year's reception, shaking hands with hundreds of visitors. Now, as he prepared to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, he paused. "If my name ever goes into history," he said to those gathered in his office, "it will be for this act. My whole soul is in it. If my hand trembles when I sign, all who examine the document will say he hesitated." So Lincoln waited. He steadied his hand, and then, with careful precision, he signed his full name, Abraham Lincoln, not the hurried A. Lincoln he usually used. With that signature, 3 million enslaved people in rebel states were declared free, and the Civil War became something entirely different. Here's what many people misunderstand about the Emancipation Proclamation. It wasn't primarily a moral gesture. It was a military strategy wrapped in moral language. Lincoln had always hated slavery personally, but as president, he'd spent 18 months insisting the war was only about preserving the Union, not ending slavery. Why? Because he needed to keep the border states, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, loyal to the Union. These were slave states that hadn't seceded, and Lincoln believed losing them would make winning the war impossible. But by late 1862, Lincoln recognized that slavery was the Confederacy's greatest strength. Enslaved people grew the food, built the fortifications, worked the factories, and freed white men to fight. As long as slavery remained intact, the South could mobilize its entire white population for war. The Emancipation Proclamation was designed to turn slavery from the South's strength into its weakness. It invited enslaved people to simply stop working, to flee to Union lines, to actively undermine the Confederate war effort. It was economic warfare disguised as moral. A crusade. And it was brilliant. But it was also incomplete. The proclamation only freed enslaved people in states in rebellion. It specifically exempted the border states and any Confederate territory already under Union control. Lincoln freed not a single enslaved person. He actually had authority over only those in areas where he technically had no power. Here's the twist that reveals Lincoln's genius. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't actually free anyone on January 1st, 1863. Think about it, it declared freedom for enslaved people in Confederate territory. But the Confederacy didn't recognize Lincoln's authority. Confederate slaveholders weren't going to read the proclamation and release their slaves. The document was, on its face, completely unenforceable. So what was the point? The proclamation was a promise, a commitment that gave the war a new purpose. It meant that every Union advance would bring actual freedom. Every mile of Confederate territory conquered would liberate enslaved people. The Union Army became an army of liberation. And enslaved people became active participants in their own freedom. And most critically, it made the war's purpose morally unambiguous. No European power could now support the Confederacy without explicitly endorsing slavery. Britain and France, which had been considering recognizing Confederate independence, backed away. The war was no longer about political disagreement. It was about human freedom versus human bondage. Lincoln had transformed the war's meaning without actually having the constitutional authority to end slavery. That would require a constitutional amendment, which would come later, but with one calculated document, he'd made that outcome inevitable. The real power of the Emancipation Proclamation revealed itself in what happened next. As Union armies advanced deeper into Confederate territory, enslaved people didn't wait to be freed. They freed themselves. They walked away from plantations. They followed Union troops. They provided intelligence about Confederate positions, guided soldiers through unfamiliar terrain, sabotaged Southern infrastructure. The contraband camps that sprang up behind Union lines swelled with thousands, then tens of thousands of formerly enslaved people. They were free but vulnerable, living makeshift shelters, often lacking adequate food or medicine. The Union Army was unprepared for this refugee crisis, but these self-liberated people refused to go back even when conditions were harsh. And then something remarkable happened. Lincoln authorized the recruitment of black soldiers into the Union Army. The Emancipation Proclamation had explicitly called for this. And by war's end, nearly 200,000 black men would serve in uniform, 10% of the Union Army. They fought in segregated units under white officers, for lower pay than white soldiers. But they fought with extraordinary courage and determination. Confederate soldiers and civilians were horrified. The sight of black men in Union blue, carrying rifles, was their nightmare made real. To the enslaved and formerly enslaved, it was liberation made tangible. The Proclamation's international impact was immediate and profound. Before January 1863, the war looked like a political dispute, states' rights versus federal authority, two interpretations of the Constitution clashing, European powers especially. Britain and France saw potential advantage in a divided America. A weaker United States meant less competition for global influence. But the Emancipation Proclamation reframed everything. Now the war was explicitly about slavery versus freedom, and Britain, which had abolished slavery in its empire 3 decades earlier, couldn't support the Confederacy without betraying its own stated values. British workers, particularly textile workers in Manchester who suffered unemployment when cotton imports stopped, had been sympathetic to the Confederacy, but after the Proclamation they rallied to the Union cause despite their economic hardship. They understood this wasn't about cotton or trade, it was about human dignity. France's Napoleon III, who'd been contemplating recognition of Confederate independence, quietly shelved his plans. The diplomatic isolation of the Confederacy was now complete. Lincoln had won a victory without firing a shot. Not everyone in the North celebrated the proclamation. Many white Union soldiers were furious. They'd enlisted to preserve the Union, not to free enslaved people. Some deserted, others threatened mutiny. Democratic politicians accused Lincoln of exceeding his authority and transforming the war into a race war. The 1862 midterm elections had gone badly for Republicans, partly because rumors of the coming proclamation had alienated conservative voters. Lincoln knew the proclamation would be politically costly. He did it anyway. But he also knew that once issued, once the war's purpose had been transformed, there could be no going back. The Union couldn't negotiate a peace that left slavery intact, not. After declaring its destruction, the proclamation made compromise impossible. It meant the war could only end one way, with Union victory and slavery's complete destruction, or Confederate independence and slavery's preservation. Lincoln had burned the bridge behind his army. There was only forward now. As you drift deeper into rest tonight, consider this. Words on paper changed reality. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't immediately free anyone. It couldn't be enforced in Confederate territory. It exempted areas where Lincoln could have enforced it, and yet it transformed everything. It gave the war moral clarity. It invited enslaved people to liberate themselves. It prevented foreign intervention. It committed the Union to a future without slavery. It turned abstract principles into concrete promises that would have to be kept in blood. Sometimes the most powerful weapons are not guns or ships, but words carefully chosen and boldly spoken. Lincoln's pen stroke on January 1, 1863, was as decisive as any battle. But declarations, however powerful, must still be defended on the battlefield. And in 6 months, the war would reach its crucial turning point on the fields and hills around a small Pennsylvania town. July 1, 1863. A cavalry skirmish on the outskirts of a sleepy Pennsylvania town was about to escalate into the largest battle ever fought in the Western Hemisphere. Neither side had planned to fight at Gettysburg. Confederate forces were searching for supplies, shoes specifically. Union cavalry had been tracking their movements. They collided by accident near a small town that most Americans had never heard of, and within hours both armies were rushing reinforcements toward this unexpected battlefield, pulled by the gravity of combat neither had intended. For 3 days, over 160,000 men would fight across farmland and hills, through wheat fields, and peach orchards around a cemetery and a seminary, when the guns finally fell silent. 51,000 men would be casualties, killed, wounded, captured, or missing, in just 72 hours. Gettysburg would produce more American casualties than the entire Revolutionary War. Tonight, as you settle deeper into rest, we walk those bloodied fields where the Confederacy's high water mark was reached and receded, never to advance so far again. The battle began as a meeting engagement, units stumbling into each other, fighting, erupting spontaneously as more troops arrived. Confederate forces initially had the advantage, pushing Union troops back through the town of Gettysburg itself. But Union General John Buford, commanding the cavalry that first encountered the Confederates, had chosen good ground. Just south of town, a series of hills and ridges formed a natural defensive position: Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and further south 2 hills, called Little Round Top and Big Round Top, anchoring the Union left flank. As Union forces retreated through Gettysburg, they rallied on Cemetery Hill. By nightfall of the first day, both armies were taking positions for what everyone now realized would be a massive battle. The Union line formed a fishhook shape along the ridges. Lee's Confederate army formed a longer, curved line facing them. Lee had won the first day. His troops held Gettysburg itself, but the Union held the high ground, and in warfare, high ground is everything. July 2nd brought some of the war's most savage close-quarters combat. Lee ordered attacks on both Union flanks. On the Union left, Confederate troops assaulted Little Round Top, a steep, rocky hill that anchored the defensive line. If the Confederates took it, they could position artillery to devastate the entire Union position. The 20th Maine Infantry, commanded by Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, held the extreme left of the Union line. They fought off repeated Confederate assaults as their ammunition dwindled. Finally, with no bullets left and Confederate troops preparing another charge, Chamberlain ordered a bayonet charge downhill. The desperate gamble worked. The Confederates broke and retreated. Meanwhile, in the center, fighting raged through the wheat field, the peach orchard, Devil's Den, places with pastoral names that became killing grounds. Control changed hands multiple times, bodies piled up in the summer heat. By nightfall, the Union line had held, barely. Both flanks had been tested to breaking point. Lee had come close to victory, but hadn't achieved it. Here's what most people don't know about Gettysburg. Lee's second-in-command, General James Longstreet, opposed the entire battle. Longstreet had urged Lee to disengage and maneuver around the Union Army, forcing them to attack Confederate positions instead. But Lee, emboldened by previous victories and believing his army invincible, insisted on attacking. The argument grew heated. Longstreet later called it the biggest mistake of the war. On the evening of July 2nd, as casualties mounted, Longstreet again urged caution. Union position was too strong, the attacks had failed, they should withdraw. Lee refused. He'd come this far, he'd brought his army deep into Pennsylvania. Retreat now would mean the invasion failed. One more attack, he believed, one decisive blow against the Union center, and the line would break. He was about to make the most catastrophic decision of his military career. July 3, 1863, Early afternoon, a strange quiet had settled over the battlefield. Then at 1:00 p.m., Confederate artillery opened fire. For 2 hours, over 150 Confederate cannons bombarded the Union Center on Cemetery Ridge. The noise was deafening, the smoke choking. It was the largest artillery barrage in the Western Hemisphere up to that point. Union artillery responded, and for 2 hours the armies tried to destroy each other with cannon fire. The Confederate bombardment was meant to soften the Union line for an infantry assault, but most shells overshot their targets, landing behind the Union position. At 3:00 p.m., the guns fell silent, and then from the tree line nearly a mile away, Confederate infantry began to emerge, 12,000 men in neat formation, battle flags flying, marching across open fields toward Cemetery Ridge. Pickett's charge, named for General George Pickett, though he commanded only part of the attacking force, was magnificent and doomed. The men marched in perfect order as if on parade, straight into concentrated Union fire. Artillery tore gaps in their lines. Canister shot, essentially giant shotgun blasts, cut down entire regiments. The survivors pressed on, still in formation, until they were close enough for Union infantry to open fire. Thousands fell within minutes. A few hundred Confederates actually reached the Union line, the high-water mark of the Confederacy, marked today by a monument. For a brief moment, Confederate battle flags flew on Cemetery Ridge. Then Union reinforcements counterattacked and the survivors retreated. Of the 12,000 men who began the charge, fewer than half returned. Some regiments suffered 80% casualties. Lee watched his shattered division stream back across that blood-soaked field. "It's all my fault," he said to the returning survivors. "It is I who have lost this fight." On July 4th, Independence Day, ironically, Lee began his retreat. A wagon train of wounded stretched for 17 miles. The Confederate Army limped back to Virginia, leaving thousands of dead on Pennsylvania soil. The Union had won, but General Meade didn't pursue aggressively. Lincoln was frustrated. If Meade had destroyed Lee's army while it was trapped north of the Potomac River, the war might have ended. Instead, Lee escaped to fight another day. But the strategic reality had changed. Lee would never again launch a major offensive. The Confederacy was now permanently on the defensive. As you drift toward sleep tonight, picture those fields at Gettysburg, the wheat trampled by thousands of boots, the peach trees splintered by artillery, the cemetery where soldiers who'd come to preserve the Union were now buried. 4 months later, Lincoln would speak there, dedicating the cemetery. His Gettysburg address would last just 2 minutes, but its words would echo forever. "These dead shall not have died in vain." The tide had turned, but the war was far from over, and what came next would be even more brutal. Because the war was about to find new commanders who understood something Lee never fully grasped, that in modern warfare the winner isn't always the most brilliant tactician, but the one willing to accept the most terrible costs. March 1864. Ulysses S. Grant stood in the White House receiving his commission as Lieutenant General, the first person since George Washington to hold that rank. Lincoln had finally found his general. Grant looked ordinary, average height, unkempt beard, rumpled uniform. He was known to drink too much, had failed at business before the war, and lacked the aristocratic polish of generals like McClellan or Lee. But he had two qualities that made him invaluable. He understood modern warfare's brutal mathematics, and he was willing to accept the cost. "I can't spare this man," Lincoln had said when critics complained about Grant's casualties. "Oh, he fights." Tonight, as you settle into deeper rest, we explore the final year of the war, when two generals, Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman, transformed the conflict into something the world had never seen before: total war, where civilian populations became targets and entire regions were systematically destroyed. This is where war lost its last pretense of honor and became purely about will. The side that could endure more suffering would win. Grant's strategy was simple and horrifying: attack continuously, everywhere, simultaneously. Give the Confederacy no rest, no chance to shift troops to threatened sectors. Except that casualties would be enormous, grind down the Confederate armies through sheer attrition. The Wilderness Campaign began in May 1864, as Grant led the Army of the Potomac into the dense forest where Lee's army waited. For 2 days they fought in terrain so thick with undergrowth that soldiers couldn't see their enemies until they were yards away. Muzzle flashes set the woods on fire. Wounded men burned to death trapped in the underbrush. The Battle of the Wilderness produced 17,500 Union casualties and about 11,000 Confederate. In previous campaigns, such losses would have prompted Union generals to retreat and regroup. Grant did something different: he kept advancing. At Spotsylvania Courthouse, the armies fought for 12 days. At one point, combat at the Bloody Angle was so intense that musket fire actually cut down trees. A 22-inch oak was felled by bullets alone. Over 18,000 Union casualties. Grant kept advancing. At Cold Harbor, Grant ordered a frontal assault that resulted in 7,000 Union casualties in just 20 minutes. Grant would later call it his greatest regret, but he didn't stop. He maneuvered around Richmond, besieged Petersburg, and settled in for a siege that would last 9 months. The strategy was working. Lee's army was slowly bleeding to death. Here's what history often misses about Grant: his reputation as a butcher is unfair. Yes, his campaigns produced staggering casualties. The Overland Campaign, Wilderness to Cold Harbor, cost the Union about 55,000 casualties, but it also cost the Confederacy 35,000 casualties they couldn't replace. Grant understood what Lee couldn't accept. Union could replace its losses, the Confederacy couldn't. Moreover, Grant's simultaneous pressure everywhere prevented Lee from using his greatest talent maneuvering to defeat isolated Union armies. Lee was pinned down, forced to defend everywhere at once. His genius for tactical victories was neutralized by Grant's a strategic relentlessness. Grant wasn't cruel, he was calculating. He'd done the math and understood that a long war favored the Union. Every battle, even costly ones, brought the end closer. Previous Union generals had sought the perfect, bloodless victory. Grant accepted that no such thing existed. War was about destroying the enemy's ability to fight, so he destroyed it methodically, regardless of cost. It was cold, it was brutal, but it worked. While Grant pinned Lee in Virginia, William Tecumseh Sherman led a different campaign in the West, one that would redefine warfare itself. Sherman captured Atlanta in September 1864, giving Lincoln the military victory he desperately needed for re-election. Then Sherman proposed something radical: he would cut loose from his supply lines, march his 60,000-man army across Georgia to the sea, living off the land and destroying everything of military value along the way. Grant approved. Sherman began his march in November 1864. For 6 weeks, Sherman's army carved a 60-mile-wide path of destruction from Atlanta to Savannah. They tore up railroads, heating the rails until they could be twisted around. Trees Sherman's neckties. They burned warehouses, cotton gins, factories. They destroyed crops, seized livestock, liberated enslaved people. Sherman had articulated a new philosophy of war. We are not only fighting hostile armies, but a hostile people, and must make old and young, rich and poor, feel the hard hand of war. The goal wasn't just defeating Confederate armies, it was breaking the Southern people's will to fight. This was total war, and it was devastating. Sherman's march to the sea remains controversial. Was it justified military necessity or war? A crime. Sherman's orders prohibited violence against civilians. His troops were supposed to forage for food but not wantonly destroy private property. In practice, discipline broke down. Bummers, foraging parties that operated with little oversight, sometimes terrorized civilians, stealing valuables and burning homes for no military reason. But Sherman's defenders argue that by making Southern civilians feel the war's cost directly, he shortened the conflict and ultimately saved lives. The South's romanticized cause became impossible to sustain when their farms were burned, their livestock seized, their economic infrastructure destroyed. Sherman reached Savannah in December, having marched 300 miles through enemy territory with minimal casualties. He then turned north into South Carolina, the state that had started the war, where his troops showed even less restraint. By February 1865, Columbia, South Carolina's capital, was in flames. Sherman blamed retreating Confederates. Confederates blamed Sherman. Likely both sides contributed. Either way, the message was clear: resistance was futile. By spring 1865, the Confederacy was dying. Grant had Lee trapped at Petersburg. Sherman's army was devastating the Carolinas. Confederate supply lines were cut, their economy had collapsed, Confederate money was worthless, soldiers were deserting in droves, heading home to protect families from Sherman's advancing army. On April 2nd, Lee evacuated Richmond. The Confederate capital burned as civilians and government officials fled. Lee's army retreated west, hoping to reach North Carolina and link up with the only other significant Confederate force. Grant pursued relentlessly. Union cavalry got ahead of Lee's army and cut off the escape route. By April 9th, Lee was surrounded at Appomattox courthouse with about 28,000 starving, exhausted men. Further resistance would just mean more deaths. Lee surrendered to Grant in Wilbur McLean's parlor, the same man who'd lived near Manassas, where the war's first major battle was fought. The war had begun in his yard and ended in his house. As you drift deeper into sleep tonight, consider what Grant and Sherman taught the world. That modern war isn't about brilliant tactics or gentlemanly conduct. It's about destroying the enemy's ability and will to fight, using every resource available, accepting terrible costs. They won not through genius but through grim determination. They understood that in industrial warfare, victory comes not to the most noble or skillful, but to whoever can endure more suffering and inflict it more systematically. The Confederacy was broken, but the war's effects, the deaths, the destruction, the trauma would echo through generations. And in 6 days, one final act of violence would remind America that wars don't truly end. When the shooting stops, imagine your money becoming worthless overnight. A Confederate dollar that could buy meal in 1861 couldn't buy a loaf of bread by 1865. Imagine your sons and brothers writing letters home saying they're starving, that their shoes have disintegrated, that they haven't been paid in months. Imagine knowing the cause you've sacrificed everything for is dying. But the leaders keep insisting victory is just around the corner. This was the Confederacy in its final year, not defeated in one dramatic battle but dying. Slowly, painfully, like a body shutting down organ by organ, the collapse took months visible. To everyone except those who refused to see. Tonight, as you drift deeper into rest, we trace the final dissolution of a nation that existed for just 4 years but cast shadows that would last for generations. Let the sadness of inevitable endings wash over you gently, like rain on a battlefield where the fighting has finally ceased. By 1864, the Confederate economy had entered a death spiral from which there was no recovery. The blockade had strangled trade. Inflation was catastrophic. By war's end, prices had increased over 9,000%. A barrel of flour that cost $7 in 1861 cost $1,000 in 1865. A Confederate currency was literally not worth the paper it was printed on. Soldiers' families were starving while the government paid them in worthless money. The infrastructure was collapsing. Railroads, essential for moving troops and supplies, were falling apart. There was no iron for repairs, no workers to make them. Trains crept along broken tracks if they moved at all. Sherman's systematic destruction of rail lines made things even worse. Food shortages became critical. The Confederacy had relied on importing food from the Midwest, now enemy territory. Southern farms had shifted to cotton production, and now those cotton fields stood useless while people starved. The Union blockade prevented food imports. Sherman's march destroyed Georgia's agricultural heartland. In Richmond, bread riots erupted as desperate women broke into stores, demanding food for their children. Jefferson Davis addressed the crowd personally, throwing money from his own pockets, worthless money, trying to quell the unrest. The Confederacy was dying from within, slowly starving. Confederate armies were disappearing not through battlefield defeat alone, but through a desertion. By 1865, men were leaving in droves, not because they were cowards, but because they'd received letters from home describing starvation, Union troops approaching, families defenseless. What good was defending Richmond when your wife and children were starving in North Carolina? Some deserted to go home. Others deserted to Union lines where they'd be fed and could take an oath of allegiance. Still others simply disappeared into the woods, becoming neither Confederate nor Union, just survivors trying to wait out the war. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, once 70,000 strong, had dwindled to about 35,000 by April 1865, and those who remained were starving, exhausted, their uniforms in rags. They fought on from habit and loyalty to Lee, not from any real hope of victory. Here's what most people don't realize. The Confederacy almost armed enslaved men to fight for the South. In March 1865, as desperation set in, the Confederate Congress passed a law allowing the recruitment of enslaved men into the Army with their owners' permission. The irony was staggering. The Confederacy had gone to war explicitly to preserve slavery. Now, facing defeat, they were considering arming the very people they'd fought to keep enslaved. Jefferson Davis supported the measure. General Lee supported it, writing that enslaved soldiers should be promised freedom after the war. Some Confederate leaders argued that enslaved men would fight well to prove their loyalty and gain freedom. Others recognize the obvious contradiction. If you're offering enslaved people freedom to fight for the Confederacy, you're admitting the war isn't about preserving slavery anymore. And if it's not about slavery, what exactly are you fighting for? The measure passed too late to matter. Only a handful of black Confederate units were ever organized, and none saw combat before the war ended. But the very consideration of the measure revealed how completely the Confederacy had abandoned its original purpose in the desperate hope of survival. April 2, 1865, Lee sent word to Jefferson Davis, Richmond must be evacuated. Immediately, the defensive lines at Petersburg had broken. Grant's army was coming. That night, Richmond descended into chaos. Government officials fled, burning documents. Soldiers destroyed supplies they couldn't take. Mobs looted stores, someone either retreating Confederates or undisciplined civilians set fire to warehouses containing tobacco and cotton. The fires spread. By morning, much of Richmond was burning. Explosions rocked the city as arsenals blew up. The James River bridges were destroyed to slow Union pursuit. Smoke darkened the sky for miles. Union troops marched into Richmond on April 3rd to find the Confederate capital in ruins. Lincoln himself visited on April 4th, walking through the conquered city with minimal security. Sitting briefly at Jefferson Davis's desk in the Confederate White House, formerly enslaved. People surrounded him, some falling to their knees. "Don't kneel to me," Lincoln said. "You must kneel to God only." So the Confederate government fled to Danville, then to Greensboro, a government without capital and administration without authority, clinging to power that had already evaporated. Even as Richmond burned and Lee's army crumbled, some Confederate leaders refused to accept reality. Jefferson Davis spoke of continuing the fight, moving to the Trans-Mississippi and waging guerrilla warfare indefinitely. Some officers suggested the army should dissolve into mountains and fight as partisans. Lee rejected these notions. He understood that guerrilla warfare would mean years of brutality, endless revenge killings, a bleeding wound that would never heal. The Confederacy was dead. Continuing to fight would only multiply the suffering. But accepting defeat meant acknowledging that everything, all the deaths, all the sacrifice, all the suffering had been for nothing, that the cause they'd believed so passionately in had failed. That vision of the future was not going to happen. For a nation built on romantic notions of honor and glory, this was perhaps the cruelest reality. As you drift toward sleep tonight, consider how nations die, not always in dramatic final battles, but often slowly, through accumulated losses and spreading despair. The Confederacy collapsed not because of one decisive defeat, but because its people couldn't endure anymore, because soldiers chose family over cause, because the economy imploded, because reality eventually overwhelms even the most passionate beliefs. There's something almost merciful in acceptance, the moment when futile resistance ends, and peace, however painful, becomes possible. And in a small Virginia village, that moment of acceptance was about to arrive. April 9, 1865, Palm Sunday, two men sat in a modest parlor in a small Virginia village and, with their conversation, the bloodiest war in American history effectively ended. One man wore an immaculate dress uniform with a jeweled sword. The other wore mud-splattered private's coat with lieutenant general stars hastily sewn on. One represented a dying nation. The other represented the future. Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant had fought against each other for nearly a year. Virginia, but they'd never met. Now they would decide together how to end the war, whether its conclusion would be marked by vengeance or mercy, whether the peace would be as brutal as the war or offer hope for healing. The choice they made that afternoon would shape the next century of American history. Tonight, as our journey through this terrible conflict concludes, we witness war's end and wonder whether anything truly ends, or whether some wars just transform into different kinds of struggles. Lee's army had been running for 6 days, trying to reach North Carolina. After evacuating Richmond on April 2nd, Lee hoped to link up with General Joseph Johnston's army in North Carolina, the last other significant Confederate force. Together, they might continue the fight or at least negotiate better surrender terms. But Grant's pursuit was relentless. Union cavalry raced ahead, cutting rail lines, burning supplies, blocking escape routes. Lee's starving army stumbled westward, shedding deserters with every mile. They hadn't eaten in days. Horses were dying. Men were collapsing from exhaustion. On April 6th at Sailor's Creek, Union forces caught and destroyed a quarter of Lee's remaining army. Over 7,000 Confederates were captured. Lee watched his army disintegrate and reportedly said, "My God, has the army dissolved?" By April 8th, Lee reached Appomattox courthouse with perhaps 28,000 men left. Union forces blocked the road ahead. More Union troops were closing from behind. Lee was trapped. That evening, Lee met with his officers. Some urged fighting to the death or scattering into the mountains to continue guerrilla warfare. Lee refused. "There is nothing left for me to do but go and see General Grant," he said, "and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." April 9, 1865, early afternoon, Wilbur McLean's parlor. Wilbur McLean had a strange relationship with the war. He'd owned a farm near Manassas, where the first Battle of Bull Run was fought. Confederate General Beauregard had used his house as headquarters. Seeking peace, McLean moved to the remote village of Appomattox Courthouse, and now, impossibly, the war was ending in his parlor. Lee arrived first in his dress uniform, determined to maintain dignity in defeat. Grant arrived half an hour later, still wearing the muddy private's coat he'd been campaigning in. For a moment they talked of old times. They'd both served in the Mexican-American War 20 years earlier. Then came the business of surrender. Here's what's remarkable about Grant's surrender terms. They were extraordinarily generous. Confederate officers could keep their sidearms, their swords, the symbols of their rank. Soldiers could keep their horses, they'd need them for spring planting. All soldiers could return home paroled, not imprisoned. There would be no treason trials, no executions, no mass arrests. Grant went further. His army had food. Lee's was starving. Grant immediately ordered 25,000 rations sent to Confederate troops. This was not the surrender of a defeated enemy to be punished. This was the reunion of a divided nation. Grant understood that the peace would be harder than the war, that reconciliation required dignity, not humiliation. Lee was surprised. His men were surprised. Many in the North would be angry. Wanted Confederate leaders punished for treason. But Grant's terms set the tone for how the war would end, not with mass executions or revenge, but with an attempt, however imperfect, to heal. As Lee prepared to leave, he and Grant shook hands. Lee mounted his horse, Traveler, and rode back to his army. Union soldiers started to cheer, celebrating victory. Grant stopped them. "The war is over," he said. "The rebels are our countrymen again." 3 days later, on April 12th, the formal surrender ceremony took place. Confederate. Troops marched forward to stack their arms and surrender their battle flags. As they approached, Union General Joshua Chamberlain, the same officer who'd held Little Round Top at Gettysburg, ordered his troops to carry arms, a marching salute of respect. The Confederates were stunned, many were moved to tears, they returned the salute. In that moment, enemies acknowledged each other as soldiers who'd fought honorably, now returned to being fellow citizens. It was a remarkable gesture, a recognition that both sides had believed they were fighting for something worthy, even though only one side had been right. But not everyone was ready for reconciliation. 5 days after Appomattox, Abraham Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater. John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer, shot him in the back of the head. Lincoln died the next morning. The assassination transformed everything. Lincoln had planned malice toward none, charity for all in Reconstruction. His successor, Andrew Johnson, was far less capable and far more vindictive. Radical Republicans in Congress seized control of Reconstruction policy. And the next decade would be marked by military occupation, political battles, and the rise of groups like the Ku Klux Klan. The war had ended, but peace remained elusive. The questions the war had raised about race, about citizenship, about who America would be, those questions remained unanswered. In many ways, they remain unanswered still. As you drift into peaceful sleep tonight, rest in this knowledge: even the worst conflicts eventually end, even the bloodiest wars finally cease. 4 years of combat, over 600,000 dead, more Americans than all our other wars combined until Vietnam. Families torn apart. A nation transformed. And on a quiet Sunday in April, in a modest parlor in a small Virginia village, 2 men chose mercy over vengeance. It wasn't perfect. The peace that followed was imperfect too, marked by broken promises and continuing injustice. But the guns fell silent. Soldiers went home. Fields that had been battlefields became farms. Again, and slowly, painfully, impossibly, a divided nation began the long work of becoming a whole. Morning always follows the longest night, even when the shadows linger. Rest well, the war is over. Let peace settle over you like morning light after the storm.